A lot of things that we could say while you are here, Rania, and perhaps one of the things we should discuss is the ongoing BRICS summit that is happening in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the 15th annual BRICS summit. Of course, we talked in the lead up to this with Vijay Prashad last week, which I think people should certainly check out. But we're seeing now the fruits, perhaps, of the summit. The big announcement that came out this morning is the 6 additional countries that are going to be added to the BRICS. I do not have it in front of me, so let's hope I get it right. Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia. How many have I listed? United Arab Emirates. That's, I think, 6. UAE. I think that's all of them. Yeah, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Argentina. I think that's them. I don't know. Sorry, Ron, did I cut you off?
No. Well, this is a big deal in so many different ways. I think that, first of all, these are not like, obviously one of these countries is Iran, which probably wouldn't surprise many people. They're just like, oh yeah, some American country is going to join BRICS, of course. But no, some of these are American allies. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt. Many people could even describe them as client states of the U.S. in many ways. I thought it was interesting that the Saudi foreign minister spoke to the BRICS members today and basically emphasized that he believes in respecting the independence and sovereignty of states and not interfering in their affairs. And I think this is important because what you see happening here is that even these very close allies of the U.S. Are demonstrating that they're they're sick of the U.S. telling them what to do. And there's an opening right now to look to other countries for partnerships, for economic partnerships, to be a part of a different economic bloc that doesn't interfere in their country. And I think that says a lot about the way a lot of countries view places like China and Russia. They don't see them as countries that try to bully them or interfere or try to violate their sovereignty. And I also think that it's, huge that you have Saudi Arabia and Iran joining. I mean, these are in the UAE, these are massive oil producing countries. And, one of the US's biggest fears about BRICS is the idea that it could undercut the US dollar by trading outside of it. And now you've got the Brazilians talking about a potential alternative currency. You're bringing in all these oil producing nations. I mean, until they actually start trading in something besides the dollar or selling oil or trading oil in something besides the dollar, it won't really make much of a difference. But there's a huge potential here. And that's why you see the West freaking out, because this does pose a potential threat to the Western hegemony over the global economy.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And UAE being added, I think, is particularly notable in that regard because India and Russia do some trade already in the dirham. And India in general has been using the dirham, the currency of UAE, a little bit more in terms of other different international transactions. And we've seen, because Dubai really in particular, but also Abu Dhabi are such big financial hubs, there's a lot of value. There's, some level of value in having the dirham. It's a flexible currency that can be used easier than a lot of the individual currencies that don't have a lot of international representation. Now, worth noting, UAE and Egypt, along with Bangladesh, had joined the BRICS Bank a couple years ago. So now to see UAE and Egypt ascend to the BRICS itself, is an interesting, we'll see, but perhaps that may be how you get a sense of some of the countries who are going to join. They joined the bank beforehand. But nonetheless, I think when you look at the reality of this, I think you see a few things. Oh, and one other note that I think is interesting too, before I say what I was going to say, Argentina, which has been and to be fair, these are invitations to join, so countries can decline. Right. Most of the countries have basically already accepted, but Argentina is the big question mark because the outgoing president, Alberto Fernandez, has been pushing this, has been pursuing this. The $44 billion in debt that the previous president of Argentina took on and the overhang of the 2001 IMF debt default have left their economy in a very tough situation. And so Alberto Fernandez has sought to build closer relations with China especially, and other countries in the global south to try to kind of reshape the ability of Argentina to rebuild its economy by opening up new opportunities for trade, for loans, and so on and so forth, because they are pretty, it's pretty difficult for them to get into the loan markets. There's a lot of pressure against them. But nonetheless, the leading candidate, Javier Milei, in the election, he has said that he's basically against the BRICS. Some of the other candidates are. It's not even clear if the successor to Fernandez, if his party won, if they would pursue it. So that's going to be an interesting question in the rest of the election campaign in Argentina of what is Argentina's future in terms of the how the country is going to be oriented. Obviously, Lula was very much pushing, the president of Brazil, for Argentina to be brought on. But I say that to say that I think when you look at the countries, it's an interesting subset of profiles because, you add Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are obviously very, very wealthy countries. UAE is already a part of the new development bank. Saudi Arabia will now become a part of the new development bank. But the new development bank, the contingent reserve arrangement that they were trying to put forward in terms of being able to lend, but being a lot fairer than the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, that element of the BRICS, the possibility, as you were mentioning, Rania, of the building out the robustness of the BRICS financial architecture will be heavily assisted by adding these two very wealthy Gulf countries into the mix. I mean, they will also gain, but it will bolster the bloc. And on the other hand, you have, Ethiopia, Argentina, Iran, which, in some ways is a wealthy country, but I think the real reason why those countries in some ways are added, it's kind of a different profile. They either have a very well-developed economy that's very diverse like Iran, or Argentina, although it's on the back foot, or like Ethiopia, have a lot of possibility to have a very developed, very robust economy. So it's sort of like they're adding immediate capacity to be able to build out the technical, infrastructural, financial base of BRICS to help the other countries that they've added reach their economic potential, which then, of course, will fold back on the BRICS and then make the BRICS even stronger. So you can see there's certainly a logic, to adding the different countries and the different modalities in terms of strengthening BRICS in the immediate term around the things they need to strengthen the BRICS in the longer term, which shows that the countries who are in BRICS are thinking very strategically about the future. And I think as Vijay reminded us last week, the whole reason BRICS existed is because, the G7 economies collapsed in 2008, and the extreme exclusion from the United Nations, the sort of marginalization inside the international architecture, that countries that are powerful and rising were looking to have some form of pushback or alternative to, even if they didn't want to abandon the old structures. It seems that logic is continuing to play itself out in the new countries that are being added to the BRICS alliance here, so the BRICS plus 6. So we'll see. I think Argentina is the big question mark. Most of the other countries, from what I've seen, have already, said yes, basically. And certainly, of course, another issue, Iran and Saudi Arabia, of their rapprochement, the détente between them, which I don't think. And I don't know this to be sure, but now that I'm seeing this, I actually do feel that their accession to the BRICS is a part of why they came together. Because you saw Saudi Arabia said that they wanted to join the BRICS when they had the Saudi-South Africa financial summit, and they gave South Africa $20 billion. And then China starts working on both countries. I mean, you just see the way that it was working, where all the BRICS nations, you had just a couple weeks ago, the National Security Advisor of India goes to Iran and says, we'll do everything we possibly can to get you into the BRICS. So it seems like there may have been a quid pro quo there for those countries to pursue a deeper diplomacy amongst themselves as the precondition for them both being able to accede to BRICS. So, of course, I don't know that for sure. I haven't seen that reported anywhere. This is just my own reading between the lines. But if I am right, I think that it also opens up a separate conversation about the role of forums like BRICS, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to become centers for also resolving some of the thornier global issues diplomatically.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point. If that is true, it basically turns these like organizations of like essentially global South countries into mediation opportunities. I think it's fantastic. On top of that, I also think it's interesting the role that the war in Ukraine may have played in pushing certain countries to want to join the BRICS bloc, in the sense that, like it's been reported that one of the reasons that Egypt, for example, wants to join is because the war in Ukraine basically caused Egypt's currency to devalue. because of the fact that there was all these investors pulling billions of dollars out of Egypt because of these wheat and fuel imports, and then that had been bought in dollars, and then it caused prices to soar. And regardless, I mean, it created a dollar shortage in Egypt that led to the currency devaluing pretty badly. And Egypt already has a really extreme poverty problem and a high unemployment. So being inside an organization like BRICS, where you have the opportunity to perhaps trade in your own local currency, is certainly an attractive idea. And then there's also the fact that you have countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Basically, they were kind of already, a bit frustrated with the U.S. because it seems as though, all of these U.S. schemes across the Middle East are just backfiring on them because they're on the front line, right? Like when it comes to the Houthis, who's getting hit by Houthi rockets? When it comes to any potential war with Iran, where is Iran going to hit? It's going to hit the U.S. client states in the Gulf, right? So there was already a frustration building, but then comes the war in Ukraine, and you've got the U.S. leaders basically like demanding, Saudi Arabia make decisions about oil that aren't actually good for Saudi Arabia, but are just good for the U.S., and demanding the UAE, stop allowing Russians to put their money in UAE banks. And it's just like, okay, but like, that's our economy. So like this, in a way you could say the arrogance and entitlement, and I mean, just downright narcissism of the U.S. And then, the way it's like been going after Russia and trying to force all of these other global South countries to do the same to their own detriment is pushing their own allies away from them, which is kind of like a funny little, irony, I guess. But I also wanted to ask you, Eugene, about Ethiopia. I think I was not expecting that. I mean, I know Ethiopia maybe had at some point said they'd like to be a part of BRICS. But I was just a bit surprised to see Ethiopia thrown into the mix. I mean, this is the second largest country in Africa. And obviously that's another situation where the U.S. hasn't exactly been very kind to Ethiopia over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, when they applied, I thought they had a pretty good chance just because they already have good relations with all the BRICS members. So I thought, they had at least a puncher's chance. But I did not know, and I won't say I was surprised, but I certainly was like, oh, they made it. I mean, I think, there's a whole range of issues that are here. I mean, I think the first issue you can raise is, and it'll go to the second issue, I mean, it is a very, I would say, negative result for the United States. I mean, in the wake of the ending of the, proxy war that was being waged by the West on Ethiopia through the agency of the TPLF, the former ruling party that launched this unbelievable war and conflict, the Western powers have been trying to use the issue of debt, the issue of IMF loans, very coercively against Ethiopia for a range of different issues, some of them political to try to get them to do certain things political, some of them economic in terms of the type of structure. Basically, you have the IMF and these other countries. They want Ethiopia to open up the economy more for foreign investment to come in and exploit the country, basically. And Ethiopia has been to some degree resisting that, to some degree not. But also politically, they're hoping to make sure that Ethiopia remains sort of a client state of the West, which under the TPLF for 32 years, it certainly was that. It was the anchor state of the region that allowed Western control. Of course, it was the agency by which Somalia was destabilized on behalf of the United States' interest to control the region. And we could go on and on like that. But I say all that just to say that by entering BRICS and becoming eligible for loans from the new development bank, which tend to be infrastructure related, but also related to food security and things like that. And certainly the new development bank is saying that they're going to be more aggressive. They just actually put out their first Rand-denominated debt issuance in South Africa recently, and it was oversubscribed. So they're raising more money in local currencies of BRICS nations as well, but then they're going to hopefully, be engaging more directly. So that means that the economic weapon of the West to try to coerce Ethiopia to do its bidding in the region, is going to go down. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think there are questions to be had about how much more debt they should take on right now, but that's a separate conversation and a separate issue. And I do think it sort of frees their hand. And I think to some degree that is why they applied to join. I mean, Ethiopia has longstanding relationships with Russia, China, India, South Africa. So they were already already working with all those countries, actually quite closely, building their trade with them and so on and so forth. So they didn't really need to technically join the BRICS bloc to continue to integrate into that. Brazil as well, they have budding relationships with them. But what you've seen is, I think, a attempted charm offensive by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on the United States and on the West. And I think he's made many choices over the past year that seem 100% designed to appease the West, but they have not actually gotten what they wanted. And the West has continued, in the U.S., by the way, there's still all these bills in Congress that could potentially sanction Ethiopia, and the Biden administration refuses to remove them. Congress refuses to address them. They still have been removed from AGOA, the free trade program that a lot of their, industrial development was sort of predicated on, at least light industrial development as well. They're still kept out of that. And the IMF is still, dancing around this issue of debt relief and seemingly obstructing the possibility for greater debt relief for Ethiopia. China has unilaterally forgiven some debt, but over some, other issues, devaluing the currency, a big devaluation, and a few other things, they're trying to push on them. But I think it's also politics. So to me, it feels like this was a move by Ethiopia to say, okay, fine, if you're going to stonewall us to this degree, we will deepen our integration even more. They were already part of BRICS Plus. We'll deepen our integration even more into this bloc and also try to join it so that we can open up some more tools in order to be able to push back against your agenda. Now, I think there's many other things that could be said, but I do think that that is sort of the base reality. And I think for the other BRICS countries, the reason why they want to have a country like Ethiopia is exactly what you said. You had 110 million people. I think probably more like 120 million. It's a very, very populous country. It's growing in terms of its economic power. It's got a lot of contradictions and problems within it, but it has a lot of powerhouse capability. It's one of the countries with the highest diplomatic stature on the African continent. And so I think it adds, in some degree to the luster of the bloc, but I think the potentiality for Ethiopia to develop also, like I said earlier, is a real sort of potential cornerstone reality for the BRICS bloc in terms of its growth to then sort of rebound 5 years down the road and really strengthening the ability of these countries to be able to trade for one another, which is the final thing I just want to actually add here about this. Maybe not the final thing, but the final thing I want to say in this round of talking, Rania, about that is I think we talk a lot about the BRICS, we talk a lot about the BRICS Bank, but we often forget, there's the BRICS Universities Network, there's the BRICS Science and Technology Collaboration, and you look at a country like India, just was the first country in the history of the planet to land a probe on one of the lunar poles. So, a lot of the countries are doing interesting things. Iran, the pharmaceutical industry is developing all these different pieces. So there's also, I think, a question for countries like developing countries like Ethiopia in particular, that are at a relatively low level of development on many of those things, how joining the BRICS bloc is an interesting test for how some of these other subsidiary parts of the BRICS actually can work. Can they help strengthen the civil society? Can they help strengthen the educational realities? Can they help strengthen the science and technology infrastructure of these countries without the mediation of the West? I think is an interesting question, an interesting one we'll see. And I think a country like Ethiopia will be an interesting test case for how these different BRICS forums are able to truly collaborate to the benefit of the members.
Yeah, I think that was a really good encapsulation of everything that we have to see. But most importantly, I just think the significance of this can't be overstated, but also it shouldn't be like thought of as like, oh yay, U.S. hegemony is over. It's not exactly what's happened. But this is definitely a part of the sort of like ongoing decline of like Western capitalism right now, of Western dominated capitalism at least. And I think this will be one of those turning point moments when BRICS expanded. Like when, like 50 years from now, when people look back to analyze, like, how did this happen? And what were the important moments? This will be one of them.
No, I think you are definitely right. And, a lot more to say about this. And I think we'll probably end up talking about it again next week. There are a number of other heads of state, by the way, that are also there, high-level officials. President of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki is there. The foreign minister of Belarus is there. A number of other African heads of states are there. So I'm sure there's a lot going on the sidelines as well. Civil society, media conversations that we'll pick up on in the wake of it. But, yes, I think it's potentially at least a very big inflection point moment.